Good morning, and thank you, Marshall. I particularly liked that challenge of thinking about a leader that we might have had some point over our lives. I'm sorry, I was one of the people who wasn't quite quick enough to put my hand up and say it, but I always think back to one of my youth leaders when I was growing up, and it's sometimes a challenge, and I've been challenged on this before. It's actually, maybe we could say thank you to one of our leaders at some point, someone leader who's had a significant effects on our lives. Maybe there's some way we could reach out and thank them, because sometimes leadership is not always the most thankful of tasks, and people don't know what impact they're having. So a good reminder there from Marshall, if there is a way that some leader in your life, someone who's been significant, you can reach out and talk to them and thank them for that. That is always a good thing to try and do. We are looking at the idea of bad shepherds. And one thing that always comes to my mind when we think about shepherds and sheep is actually, we probably don't know many shepherds, but I'm just looking out, and there is actually shepherds in our church, but let's say a bit wild. We don't know people who are shepherds in their job. We might know some people whose surname is Shepherds. But maybe we don't know many people who are actual shepherds, and it's harder for us to maybe get our mind around this, because for the people hearing it several thousands of years ago, they might have been some nearby, they might have been shepherds themselves. That would be more of a common job, a common role. For us, I don't know how far we have to go to find a shepherd from here. I know as you drive around the M25, bizarrely, there's sheep perched on the hills right by the M25, but I don't know if that means there's shepherds. So we have to think a bit harder about the idea of shepherds. But we'll get on to that in a moment. I don't expect you to be able to read this. I certainly can't read it from here. That's not the point of putting this up. But the idea is there's something I've come across called the Bible Project. And if you want to engage more with some of the books of the Bible, they have a really great way of presenting in short, sort of 10, 15-minute video clips. They have a couple that cover Ezekiel. And it's I find a real good way to get into a book. They work through the overall themes of the book. They show you how the chapters divide up. You have a sense of where it sits in a story or in the history of what's going on in the Bible. So if you want to learn more about Ezekiel and maybe look ahead to some of the things that are coming up in the other later parts of this series, I really recommend you to take 10 or 15 minutes out of your day and look up the BibleProject.org, and you'll see these. They're presented in quite a dynamic way. They're well done, they're well annotated, and have a lot of good, useful information. And what we see is that essentially in Ezekiel, we've reached about the halfway point. Chapter 33 is a real big turning point of Ezekiel. Jerusalem has fallen. Everything Ezekiel's been warning about, the message from God that he's been warning about for the first part of the book, has sadly come true and wasn't heeded. And it's talked about how the second half goes into more of a time of hope of how things can be better in the future. But actually what we get at the beginning of chapter 34 anyway is not so much hope and more of warning. The hope for the section we're looking at now comes at the second part of chapter 34, and you'll have to wait till Keith next week to look ahead to that idea of hope. But there is a hopeful ending to this. But we're in a period at the beginning of Ezekiel 34 of really looking at the warning for bad shepherds, telling the people to be aware of bad shepherds, warning the bad shepherds themselves, and we saw as Toby excellently read out for us earlier, how it ended for those shepherds. And God was very strict on the people that he were in a position of leadership, and they abused that position of leadership, and we see that in those verses. Maybe when we think about shepherds and sheep, maybe something like this comes to mind. I don't know if this is completely legitimate. I don't feel like the sheep could have got itself in that ring. Who knows how this ended up like that. But when we think about shepherds and sheep, we maybe need to think about the fact that it's not a great analogy for us if we're thinking about the ones being the sheep. Because the point is that sheep need looking after. Sheep can get themselves in trouble. Sheep left to their own devices may well be able to get in a tyre swing and swing themselves around like this. I don't quite know. But the point the Bible's making in so many ways is that God's people, the Israelites back at the time of Ezekiel, and as we're trying to look at and understand for us today how we can learn from these stories, us today, we need to understand that the analogy is used because the sheep needed the shepherds to guide them, the shepherds to watch over them, the shepherds to protect them. And if you know your stories around other places in the Bible, the idea that the shepherd might lie in the gap in the gate and actually physically protect the sheep at night, that was part of the job. That's why they would often live out with the sheep in the fields for many months. So we have this picture of sheep and shepherds, and maybe some of it makes sense for us today. Maybe we have to sort of use our imagination a bit to understand how it fits in and try and think what it would have meant to the people hearing it 2,000 years ago. But ultimately it's coming down to the idea of leaders. And we have leaders in this church in different ways. And here's just some of them. And I'm really sorry because I know that there's some people in this church who have missed off this. And I just don't take that as any sort of slight. I had to just fit some on here. And we have different ways of leadership in church. And we maybe start to think of Keith, our pastor. And if this was just to be a talk to the pastor of the church, well, that would be a bit tricky because he's not here this morning. And not that we need to, and certainly I don't need to lecture him on how he does his job, because he does a fantastic job of pastoring us. But it's not just thinking there's the pastor and then the rest of us get on with it. We actually have, in this Baptist church and many Baptist churches, we have different types of leadership roles that some people are appointed to. And then we also talk about leaders of certain areas of the church. There's leaders of our music group. There's leaders currently out the back leading our children's work. There's people who lead our Discover groups on Sunday evenings, people who lead our home groups. We have worship leaders. There's many different roles that have the name leader in it. But also, I came across quite an interesting quote. I think that actually there's an idea of influence. And the quote says that if we're obeying God's call to be using our influence for good, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. If you're being salt and light as Jesus commanded, then you have begun to obey God's call to leadership. And this is from a guy called John C. Maxwell, who was so enthused about leadership in Christian context. Well, he put together what he called a leadership Bible, in terms of going through the Bible and picking out the places where there's biblical examples of leadership. And he's made an entire Bible highlighting that. So we have different ideas of leadership, don't we? And just to explain just back a second on here, if you're not aware of how it works in our church and other churches, we have the concept of trustees. We're a charity, and there's certain people, myself included, and others that have signed up to be elders, deacons, and the pastor included that, and that's part of a role of oversight of the church. And there's different ways that takes place. Sometimes we talk about, I've heard it described as the deacons are the practical side of things and the elders are the spiritual side of things. That's maybe not the best way to do it, because we're saying then that not all of leadership is spiritual, and of course all of leadership in a Christian context should be spiritual. Another way to think about it is maybe the deacons handle organisation and the elders handle pastoral care. And ultimately, for us to work as a church in the way that Baptist churches work, that's the model we follow. We need people who are willing to take those roles. We need people who are willing to serve in those roles. And I want to acknowledge that many people here have served in those roles over many years. They've committed their time and energy to do that, to lead us in different ways. And it's not always the most exciting of roles, I know that from first hand, but it's the roles that are important, because if we don't have the fundamentals of how we run our church in place, we end up with maybe the situation of the bad shepherds. If we don't have people who are willing to, in fact, I had a conversation with someone this morning who was pointing out that we need to look at some of the things around our fire safety. If we don't have people who are willing to make sure that our building is safe for people to be in, we have a problem. If we don't have people who are willing to have some sort of oversight on how we do safeguarding and we look after the children in our church, we have a problem. If we don't have people who are willing to get the health and safety right, we don't want to give everyone food poisoning when we serve food out the back. There's all these sorts of roles. And on top of that, we have pastoral roles, setting the spiritual direction of the church, ensuring everyone is looked after, everyone has a place in our church, and making sure that people are understood, and ultimately we set the things in the right direction. Because for whatever leadership in terms of human leadership we have in our church, we're seeking to be a church with God's church with Jesus at the head. So whatever human roles we had of leadership, they're not, we wouldn't say, and I know Keith has said this himself, it's not Keith's church, it's God's church, and we have particular people who are in leadership roles. Another point on the way it works in Baptist churches is many of our leadership roles are voted for. If you're a member of our church, you get to come along to meetings and vote for many different things, but one is when we appoint different people. And a quote that someone shared with me this week maybe sums a bit of this up. It's from Thomas Jefferson. It says, "The government you elect is the government you deserve." There's a part for all of us to play in looking at how we elect people to be leaders in our church, to understand who are the right people. We're appointed in our roles as leaders, and we need support from others to make those roles work, but we do have a process of voting for leaders in our church. So there's different types of roles of leadership in our church. There's different people right at this moment leading groups out the back. There's people in the week who've taken part in leading others in many different ways. There's the idea that every one can have influence, positive influence, hopefully, over other people, even if they don't have a role that has the word leadership in it as well. But on to the chapter of Ezekiel, and it has some pretty strong words, doesn't it, to say. It's a pretty tough warning. We might not like these verses when we see different ones where God is pretty clearly upset, and when God is upset about people's behaviour, he does things, it takes definite action, and in this case, God removes the shepherds from their roles. And why did he do that? What were they doing? Well, it comes down to a few things, really. They were taking care of themselves above the sheep. They were put in a place where they were meant to lead the sheep. They were meant to be in charge, but they were meant to put the needs of the sheep ahead of their own needs. They were also keeping the best for themselves, not allowing it to be used for the sheep, for the Israelites. They were worrying about themselves, their own health, above the health of their flock. They were ruling harshly and brutally, and they were abandoning and scattering the sheep. And we can read how this plays out in many other books of the Old Testament around that time. There was almost a pattern of like a good king, followed by a bad king, followed by a good king, and so on and so on. And whilst the Israelites themselves, as in the example, the analogy of sheep, didn't always do a great job, they definitely had some bad leaders along the way. And God is making it clear through Ezekiel that he's not happy about that situation. That's not how it is meant to be. It is not the way that Christian leadership is meant to work. And ultimately, I guess it comes down to, in this case, the leaders were putting themselves above the people they are meant to lead. And I guess that's one of the places where Christian leadership is maybe different than the model of leadership we see elsewhere, doesn't it? If we think about leadership, I don't know what first comes to mind, whether it's leadership in politics or in sport or in work or other sort of places. And that model of leadership is quite different than the leadership we should see in church. So God is warning through Ezekiel these bad shepherds, and he's making it clear. And the ending, as Toby read to us earlier, it ends up, God in verse 10 of Ezekiel 34 says, "I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I'll remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them." I think these verses are quite clear on some of the criteria that Christian leaders can be judged on. And actually, from having chatted to different people over the years, sadly I know that some people have ended up in our church, not sad they ended up in our church, sadly they've come from churches where there's been examples of bad leadership. I know from talking to different people over the years, they've been in churches where maybe finances haven't been handled, or there's been a problem with the leaders where they haven't been willing or properly leading their flock, or different things. And from those conversations, I understand that it's a tough situation to be in. Church is not meant to be like that. It's not the model that God wants. And if people are getting in the way of other Christians developing their lives because of the bad leadership, that's a problem. And so I hope that that's not something that ever happens here at Slough, but it requires people to be leaders and lead us in a way that is biblical. And I hope that for people who've had those situations, they're able to move on and see God's good in other situations and be able to start to have a positive relationship again after those tough times. But I think that's the crux of why God is so harsh against leaders, because he knows the effect that bad leaders can have on, in the scenario, the sheep, the people who need pointing in the right direction, the people who need to be led well, the sheep that would otherwise get themselves stuck in a tire, or however we want to think about the analogy. What we see in Ezekiel 34, 1-10 is not the way it's meant to be. And I've talked already that we see the good part of that in contrast that Keith's going to talk to us about next week, but we have to kind of understand the bad part to maybe appreciate why God does things differently and what God's response to this, particularly in the situation in Ezekiel, is. But you'll have to wait next week for that. So we see the example of bad shepherds in Ezekiel. I think a really good way to flip it around and understand part of what church leadership involves is just taking the opposite, essentially, of what everything they did in those verses. They were called out for their bad behaviour. Doing the opposite is what God wants. He wants leaders who take care of their flock. He wants leaders who give their best to their people that they're leading. He wants leaders who strengthen the weak and the sick. He wants leaders who rule. Part of being a leader is in sometimes making decisions, ruling people, but he wants that done lovingly and gently and in a way that God wants it to be done, not in the way that humans want it to be done. He wants people that take the time to gather and protect the sheep. We put that maybe at church under the idea of pastoral care. Look after those in the church, those on the edge of church, those who need someone to talk to, however that might come out. So I think taking the opposite of Ezekiel, the beginning part of Ezekiel, is a good way to understand Christian leaders. But I think there's a bit more to it as well. It's very hard to get a picture to really sum up integrity, but anyway, I went for the word integrity, because a part of what being a leader is about integrity and character. And if you were to go into sort of a bookshop and look for the books around, how to lead in companies, and I'm sure they might talk about this a little bit, but I think the main thing in leadership outside of the church is looking at skills and ability and to be able to talk or to be able to present or whatever it might be. But actually the Bible takes a different approach. If you were to look at 1 Timothy 3, 1-14, which is some quite famous verses that discuss deacons and elders, it does mention a couple of skills, but most of all of what it says in there is around qualities of people. It talks about being above reproach, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome. And there's many more in there. That's only some of them. You can read that. It's an entire, we could spend an entire sermon just focusing on that particular passage. But if that's something you're interested in, I encourage you to read it, because the point it's making there and elsewhere in the Bible is it's about character and integrity. Sure, there is the need for abilities and talents. It would be very hard for John, our church treasurer, if he had no appreciation of numbers. That would be tricky for him to do that role. But what we also need in those sorts of roles and many others is integrity, trust, ability to be careful with the resources we have and steward those in a good way. And also it's very clear that we can read in somewhere like Ephesians 4 or other places where that God equips people, God gives people gifts and abilities. We don't have to expect people in leadership roles to be fully formed as a complete article. It says in Ephesians 4, 11 and 12, the gifts God gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. God can take people's existing talents and abilities and do more with them. He can supply gifts that people need to do particular roles if they're willing to step into those roles. But another part of Christian leadership, and I might have to explain why I'm showing some pictures of overflowing rubbish. I know that many people here take part in our monthly litter pick. And if you don't know what that's about, is that some fantastic people from the church go out and they give up their time on a Saturday morning. And I know that there's many more fun things they could be doing on a Saturday morning, but they feel that we want to bless the area around our church. We're located in where we are in Slough. There's residential places around, and if you've ever walked around, there's some litter that piles up. I'm sure it's been noticeable if you're coming in the morning. And some people here take it on themselves to go out and clean up as a way of expressing for our community that we're a church here and we want to make a difference to our community. It's a very practical way of doing that. And I just, want to thank the people who are willing to do that on a Saturday. But if Keith or anyone else who wanted to organise that took the approach of saying, right, I want people to go out litter picking. Here's a high-vis jacket because we want to be visible. Here's some litter pickers. I'm going to be in my office drinking cups of tea while you do that. And I'm saying that because I know that that's not what Keith does. I know for a fact that he's out there with the high-vis jacket and the litter pickers giving up part of his time on a Saturday morning. And I think there's something in that as a model for Christian leadership as well, isn't it? And I think that is one of the places where it really is different from leadership outside the church. The idea of servant leadership, leading with a servant heart, being prepared to do the work yourself as well, whether that work is litter picking, whether that is tidying up the chairs at the end of a meeting, whether that is tidying away after food, or whatever it might be that needs doing. Now, I'm not saying clearly that every leader in the church can spend their entire time doing all those things. Sometimes the rest of us need to help out as well. But it's the principle, isn't it, that the leaders are willing with a servant heart to serve in that sort of way. Another way of maybe thinking about it is when we have fellowship meals out the back, if all the leaders in the church were the ones up the front, insisting they went first while the food was, they could get the best choice of food, well, actually, that would go pretty much against what the verses in Ezekiel say, where the leaders then were criticised for taking the food for themselves. There's something about that servant leadership, isn't it, of putting your own needs aside for the sake of others. And I guess we see it most clearly in what Jesus did. Jesus washed his disciples' feet. It's hard to think of a more low, dirty job, particularly if you imagine at that time, this was not a time of socks and nice shoes that kept your feet clean. This was open-toe sandals. This was a different, dusty sort of situation. Jesus washing the disciples' feet was showing something of servanthood. And he did it, and he says in John chapter 13, he was doing it to model that leadership to them. He could have told them that's what he wanted to do, and they would have probably gone along with it. This was the people he was training up. But in this case, Jesus got down there and did it for them and said, this is the example I'm setting for you of leadership, of humility, of serving one another, and I want you to follow that example. We're going to come along to communion in a short little while, but before we do that, I just want to leave some challenges for us to think about these verses. Going back to the example of the sheep at the beginning, there is some level where actually we need to think about how we allow others to lead us in the situations where we are led by others. It doesn't mean that we should put aside any of our thoughts and not be willing to stand up if things are wrong at all. But part of what happened with the Israelites in many different ways is they disobeyed their leaders. Clearly God is making a point here of the leaders led them badly, that's clear. But I think there's other times where we have to think about, are we allowing the people that have been appointed by this church, by following God's will to lead us, are we allowing them to lead us? How can we support and encourage our leaders as well? Part of this, and I know many people already do this, is praying for the leaders in the church. Maybe we could acknowledge what they do, like Marshall's reminder at the beginning. If there's been someone who's done something significant for you in this church or elsewhere, maybe thanking them, sending them a short note, specifically saying, thank you very much for this time. This thing you said or this thing you did struck me and it helped me in my life. What about supporting them? That's a bit harder, isn't it? Sometimes we could maybe actually go out of our way to say to someone, is there anything I could help you with? Is there something that you're doing that you're struggling with and it would be helpful if someone did you? We don't want to be a place where we just sit back and say that's for the leaders to do. There is certain roles that people have, there's certain roles that people have stepped up to and been willing to do, But that doesn't mean they should always do that in isolation. They should always do that to the point that they're burnt out or unable to do it to the best of their ability. So sometimes we need to support them, share the load with them. And that ultimately might mean that actually God is calling some people here to leadership. To be frank, at the moment we're looking for more people to be deacons. And it's something I can attest to, being one of those deacons, is that we need people to be willing to do those roles. And this applies for many other roles, but this particular one that Keith talked about a few weeks ago, and we're going to repeat that idea now. If people feel led to be in a leadership role here at Slough, there is different roles that people can take part in, but particularly at the moment we are looking for people who might want to be deacons. About 9 years ago, Andy, who was our pastor at the time, said in the meeting, we have lots of things we want to do, but we need people to help us do them. And it took me a while, and it took some encouragement from different people, and it took me thinking about it, but in some way I stepped up to that because I felt that it was right. I thought that actually I couldn't necessarily help with the things they wanted to do, but I could help support more generally, and that's my response in that case was becoming a deacon. Different people, having chatted to other deacons, have different ways they end up. Sometimes we have a very specific need that we need someone at that time, and there's people that have the right skills and that fits. There's other time where people hear the call to need more in our church and they're willing to step up. There's different people arrive in different ways. Sometimes there is a need for roles to be filled in this church, and we can't always expect others to do it. It's not right that everyone in a church is a leader. That wouldn't make sense. There's different roles. We need to understand what's God calling us specifically to do. But sometimes we might look and think that's for someone else, that's not for me. And there's a challenge there, isn't it, that actually sometimes we're the right person to step into that role. Quite a long time ago, I was involved in a Growing Leaders Youth Edition. I wasn't part of the youth at that time, but I think some of the people who are actually youth at that time might be currently in this church quite a bit older. But there is courses or there is resources available, and if that's something you're interested in, you speak to me afterwards. But the point of also showing this is actually, it's not just about thinking, right, when I get to a certain age, I'm suitable for a certain role. We want to be a church that encourages people where they're at to grow into different roles. I was very encouraged working through that course quite a long time ago now, and bits of it have helped me in different roles in the church. But we don't want to make it that it's only for certain people at a certain time. We want to be open to people who feel the call of God on their heart to lead in this church. So to finish, if you think that's you, please talk to me or any of the other deacons or elders. Please have a chat with someone to find out more, to explore what's involved. There's people who have been in those roles previously you could talk to as well. We just want to give people opportunities to follow what God might be saying in their lives. I've been very struck by Marshall recently, in many different ways, but if you don't know, Marshall is looking at the moment into a role of leadership and training and things like that. And one thing that struck me is that it's something that God said to him a while back in his life, and he's continued developing that, and this now is the time for him to move on with that and move into something different. So God can work in different ways in our lives. He might have been calling us to something, preparing us for something for a while, and then we move into different roles. There's roles for times and seasons, but my prayer is that people are open to whatever way God might want to lead them into something new. And if you do think that's a role of leadership in this church, please take the time to pray about it, to understand more of what's involved and chat to someone about it. Amen.